today I am here actually talking about a real-life experience, recent, actually concluded only last Friday, of a participatory mechanism for rural proofing, where in Spain, where we actually tested whether rural proofing was actually possible to undertake in a large scale in Spain. Just this is a bit of background that's not necessary. As I say, this is the first ever nationwide exercise. It was organized by a civic organization well versed on rural entrepreneurship and rural development, and organizing the biggest rural development event in Spain called Presura, which is held every year and has like very strong ownership across Spain, but it's also been supported by a number of public authorities and my Spanish equivalent in the municipal sector. The group essentially has been working for a year. It's 100 members, and essentially what we wanted to test is the open participatory approaches in actually doing rural proofing, and not like the formal structural ones that many of you will be aware, and we have had a number of them so far already. We came up with 70 proposals on specific pieces of legislation that are unduly affecting rural areas, mostly negatively, as you can imagine. The final conclusions were presented on the 21st of January in a rather big event as well. And I think, and as I will try to explain as a bit of introduction, rural proofing is and must be a new endeavor, because the extreme weight of EU policies, the environmental and rural and the funding element in rural areas in Spain, other places, but also because Spain, for things I will try to briefly show by a number of maps, is a test case on policies against the population. I mean, the particularity of Spain is that this debate on rural proofing is embedded in the larger debate about the future of rural areas and future of the population, which is a slightly different approach to what you find in other places for reasons you will try to show in a moment. Well, this is the map, just to start from a European perspective, and then we'll go to the Spanish, more local version of it. This is the well-known map about the future of many rural areas in the next few decades. And actually at the moment, it's a rather widespread risk of the population in many areas. And that's, as I say, not rural proofing shouldn't be about the population, but from a Spanish perspective, this is what has coalesced in the public mind in a very large way. Of course, if we see that from a European perspective, and in order to shape EU policies, we need to actually have the right rural lens. And the problem is sometimes the European rural lens doesn't capture reality. In the green map is a rather standard map of areas, urban and rural. But actually, you look at the other map, which is produced in Spain, but also there's equivalent in other international organizations. That's where people actually live, and you see the Spain being very sparsely populated itself, and actually having a pattern of population more similar to Iceland than to neighboring France. And that's why, how we see at the European scale, in which lens we apply the European scale, has a strong effect on how we design policies, how we deliver policies and funds, it should be said. Equally, this is another example of the same, depending which criteria you use. For instance, the Eurostat NUTS 3 level, which is what we normally use for a lot of more local impacts of assessment, is simply not very reflective of reality, and has been a challenge to actually use a number of pan-European statistical units in order to actually identify properly rural local impacts across Europe and certainly in Spain. This is another example. We're not explain. This is actually the green is about the just transition areas, which are pretty random areas, doesn't really reflect real geographies. And the other map with the many colors is the map of the actual future of rural areas of the Commission, where you can see that this issue of the population is rather expansive. Everything that's not blue in the map has the population issues, so that's not a minor issue, but still it doesn't capture enough reality, and that's why rural proofing from a Spanish perspective is quite of an important thing. But coming back to Spain, well, this is a very simplified map about the situation in Spain. Everything that is yellow is called empty Spain. This is just a generic term that captures people's imagination in Spain. Is one of the big topics at the moment in Spain, so much there is even a vice presidency of the Spanish government only or mainly dedicated to these issues. So as I say, it's something that happens all across the center of Spain, but also in other inland areas. everything that is a say in yellow. Just to show the growth of this concern in the public mind of Spanish people for the last few years. It's actually coincide with the publication of a famous book that captures essentially people's imagination in a way that hasn't happened in other countries in Eastern Europe, which, for instance, there's far more problem with the population than in Spain. But just capture the agenda in Spain in a way that has not everywhere else, and that will have an impact in how we do rural proofing. So much that this is a number of all these areas in red are areas, provinces, regions that have problems of the population, darker the worse. And these are a number of many organizations, some of them represented here today in today's meeting, but many others who are actively working on this issue. So it's something that really, there's people working on this across Spain. But it's not just that, it's actually getting into political. You see here some people you might know from Spanish government and politicians, and big demonstrations about the future of the so-called empty Spain. So it's actually spillover from scientists or practitioners or rural communities to actually being a major political issue in Spain, that it can actually spill over to the electoral map in the regional elections that will happen in a couple of weeks. This is the map designed from European level that will be a separate story, and shows you in a more granular way how the problem is of the population is affecting Spain in a way that is certainly in Western Europe quite significant. There's a different way of taking that, but it's not a minor issue. Now, so what's been done for tackling this? Well, just in a context, there's been a number of policies at national level. There's even a commitment to spend 10 billion euros of the Next Generation EU on this, on 130 measures, which includes for the first time rural proofing as a national policy. And there's now draft legislation on evaluating public policies that might also include rural proofing as part of the way the Spanish government evaluates public policies and design new public policies. Having said that, because the Spain, most of the powers, a bit like in the UK and certainly federal countries like Germany or Italy, most of the policies on economic development, rural areas are regional, and therefore what each region does in their own ways is quite important. I here just highlight Castilla-La Mancha, which is this big blob of yellow that I showed earlier in the central part of Spain, surrounding Madrid through the south. And they actually created a new law that actually enshrines rural proofing in their policy making. Actually, they created maps. This is actually a legal map. It's not an academic map showing the extent of the problem in the region. I think that now puts that region in the same level as Northern Ireland, as it was mentioned earlier. And I would say that's a case of best practice. But that's still not enough, because the Spanish powers, Spanish regional and national powers are actually very much enmeshed. Like the UK, for instance, or Canada, regional and national powers are very much shared most of the time in most issues, including economic development issues, and therefore you need a nationwide effort. What it was felt, there was not necessarily a sufficiently appropriate rural proofing methodology in Spain, and whatever it was scattered and very legalistic. And that's why we moved through this group that I had the privilege to be one of the 3 coordinators that were working for a year. It's 100 people from different walks of life, practitioners, experts, local and regional politicians, a few variety of people. We will focus on 4 axes: quality of rural areas services, rural infrastructure, rural economy, and sustainable economic, rural and sustainable development, and then, of course, the more democratic issue, which is rural legislation in these areas, EU, national, and regional, which I think affect in different ways rural areas. This is just to show the people who were part of this group. You see, there's no faceless bureaucrats, and there's not like sandal-wearing activists. There's a bit of everything, and that's what it should be done. They all have like a previous record on working in rural areas or economic development in those areas, or simply evaluation of public policies, and that's the different talents that we want to put together to work on this for a year. I would say that in the Spanish context, the fact there was a pandemic was good, because in Spain, if you organize meetings without in person, that takes a lot of time. Whereas like this, we actually could work virtually most of the time, and that's been actually extremely helpful for that. And just to show again, the first conclusions of the report were presented a few months ago in the intermediate report, and you see all the Spanish Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, All the political parties were there in Soria, which is in central Spain, and once ground zero of the population by seen by many people actually supporting that. I doubt that anybody else in the world you will see national politicians actually trying to take the glare of the effort on rural proofing. I think that shows the importance of this matter in Spain at the moment. There is actually 100, we organized 19 working groups. I was one of the 3 coordinators. The terms of reference were rather open because, for legalistic and technocratic approaches, we already have that in Spain, not in an organized way, but they exist. We focus on identifying problems and on that the connection with between EU domestic and domestic law and policies. We obviously took examples of some of the documents, including Professor Atherton's previous work on that, on these comparative examples, as well as previous publications of ENRD, which were advanced reviews, and the OECD, I would have to say as well. And as well, part of my work as well was to link that with the EU better regulation agenda. We came with 70 proposals. There's a combination of things. One's policy, the other regulatory, the other governance. And the others, of course, is wishful thinking, but it's not in the nature of a very open participatory approach to have this diversity of views and the diversity of solutions. But I think I would say that the rural proofing methodology, by way of an open participation method, has been validated by this exercise and actually identify a number of gaps in the way territorial impact assessments in rural areas, rural proofing has been done in Spain so far. And I think it could be replicable in other countries as well. Main findings, and just going straight to findings and conclusions. I mean, of course, the importance of EU law is very big in rural areas, and actually sometimes more important than domestic policies. However, the crucial factor is how they are transposed and delivered in Spain, the famous gold plating. And Spain is particularly bad at that because it's extremely legalistic. The administration is very risk averse. And we have actually identified cases in the Pyrenees, the mountains between Spain and France, where EU health rules for rural entrepreneurs are the same across both sides of the border, but in France they are very loose, and therefore a local herdsman can actually sell in their own farm their own cheese, whereas in Spain you are basically forced to actually go through very industrial processes. Well, I mean, the same rules are the same, just in Spain the administrative culture is very legal, even more legalistic than France, if that will possible to believe, and certainly even more risk averse than France. There is also more generally a weak culture of evaluation of public policies. There is evaluation of public policies, but it's very not independent enough, very often isolated between the national, regional, and local levels, which is a problem, as most policies in Spain are interdependent between the 3 levels. Nobody actually works in separately in most policies. And actually sometimes even within departments, within regional administrations, between mini government ministries, there's no coordination whatsoever. And then this excessive legalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the political discretion of Spanish politicians is, I would say, higher than if you compare to, I would say, Northern Europe. Just put a broad example. There is no very weak participatory involvement in policy and lawmaking. There's just general standard consultation that certainly they are inferior in substance than what we are used, for instance, at the European level in the guidelines of participation and consultation that exist at EU level. In Spain, is even much weaker than that. And as I say, there's a preference to be safe and over-regulate rather than just design policies that are effective. On the other hand, it's not just the governments or the regions. I think the actors in the areas, in the territories have a problem. I mean, of course, there is 8,000 municipalities. I mean, compared to Scotland, which is only 32 or 500 across the UK, from my most example I can give from my own work. There is far too many municipalities, good for local democracy and for identifying local communities as what they are, political entities and living entities. But they don't have capacity. Then the competences, the powers, I mean, the associated powers by each level of governance are very, very mixed, but at the same time, there's a lot of gray areas, duplication and gaps. There's not a set definition of minimum standards of local services that public authorities or institutions could provide local areas, so therefore there's a lot of gaps. The key players, i.e. for instance, broadband operators, essentially don't really have rural proofing or the impact of their extensive infrastructure in their areas. as a regulatory maze that hamper rural entrepreneurship and migration to rural areas. Like in COVID crisis, we have a lot of people who want to go to rural areas, but good luck to finding a house, and how good luck to actually restoring a house if you want to do that. I mean, that's another thing. Housing policy is second after economic opportunities as a factor in people's choices to stay or go to rural areas in Spain. And really, the policies designed so far are not granular enough to actually operate, and that's actually an issue. Then there is a wider issue in Spain these days about the relation between big farming sector and the small farming sector, and whether it is the best approach. And as I say, then economic approaches as well. For instance, there's a big drive for wind energy, solar and hydrogen in Spain, and actually that's normally not sufficiently taken into account the needs of the people who actually live there. And that's an issue of major controversy at the moment in Spain. Recommendations, and I promise it's just
Serafin,
the last.
sorry, just to indicate you have 2 more minutes. Thanks.
No, it's fine. I just have 2 more slides, I think. So
perfect.
So
That's
I promise you will be 15 minutes despite the numbers of slides. So we by my terms of the promise. 4 recommendations. The Spanish rural proofing must be framed and participate and be really actively part of the process of rural proofing. There's no sense of making a rural proofing a model in Spain that is dissociated from the EU, because most EU policies or EU policies have a disproportionate effect in rural areas. I would say even more than in urban areas, because of the common agricultural policy and environmental legislation. And that's why it's important that rural proofing as well at EU level is properly embedding EU better regulation processes, even better than was the case so far with the so-called urban agenda, which was part of, it was a bit like urban proofing, but in rural areas, in urban areas, and it's not properly connected with the way the Commission really does policy. So that's quite important. The experience of other countries shows that we need to create a rural proofing exercise, but for instance, in Spain, a lot of people is in love about Scotland and the fight against the population in the Highlands, and they'll get surprised when I tell them, well, actually, that works for Scotland, but you don't imitate that in Spain. That will not work. It's simply a different political culture, and the rural proofing exercise is to be that realistic about the political culture institutions you got in a country, rather than just pretending you're suddenly Scottish or Swedish or Canadian, for that matter. You need to decide whether you want a sectoral approach or a horizontal approach in rural proofing, and what are the bodies that need to be properly working on this. And some people prefer to have a single agencies. There is advantages and also problems with that, because you end up actually creating silos. But the problem is you got like a coordinated approach in rural proofing. You run the risk in places like in Spain, which is famous for not being that coordinated, to actually have a rural proofing system that doesn't really work. And that's, I think, a lesson that can work for other countries as well. But it is quite clear that what you need is a holistic approach. And in Spain, for instance, I will not mention all the institutions you see there, which are national institutions, and they are replicated at regional level with the same regional equivalents of all these institutions. All of that do evaluation of public policies. All of them do some element of rural proofing in one way or another, but they simply not work with each other. So in the end, it's a duplication gaps of sectors and assessments, which are actually counterproductive. And finally, in addition to more coordination, holistic approaches, what it shows is that a lot of these exercises that I mentioned in this slide from different bodies, because they don't have the element of the rural participatory mechanism, that actually become formalistic and actually miss the point, because people living in Madrid or in the regional capital don't really actually live in the rural areas, and that's why it has to be a proactive rather than just a protocolary civic participation mechanism for rural proofing to be effective and to provide actual results. These are just the links of all the documents that I've been mentioning that we work in the G100. They are in English, Spanish, but rest assured there is an interest from you. We can make sure that make available in English as well. And thank you very much for that. Thank you very much.